Hello, everyone. Welcome to Where I Belong podcast. Today we have with us Tiago. He is an author, and his recent book In Search of Finite is out. So, if anyone is interested in unusual read, definitely go and check that out. Welcome, Tiago. It's good to have you here with us. One of the questions that I want to ask you the most is that religion gets so much of bad rap these days. The way I see religion, it is that it is so comforting and it is so soothing us from suffering and offering us solace in hardships. Like all the religious scriptures that we know of mostly offer moral teachings and also ask us to forgive others, and whatever that happens in our life, we are usually resort to the towards religion for the comfort. So my question is that how do you see religion, and what significance does it hold for you in your life?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you a lot for the invite. It's a pleasure to have you. And that's a great question. And a very complicated question. That's perhaps
Yeah.
one of the most complicated questions there is. But I would say, first of all, about the comfort issue, like that's a very common perception of religion. That's almost like the mythos of our culture, which is just like, it's like Marx popularized it. It's like religion is the opium of the masses, which is like a very much in that line of thought. To some degree, obviously, there's an element of religion, and also let's remember that when we speak about religion, we're making massive oversimplifications, right? Because there's a lot of variety of religion. So from now on, unless you want me to do it differently, I'll just broadly kind of like speak as if I'm speaking about the Abrahamic religion. So there's definitely an element of what you spoke about, of just like the comfort. And I would say that's especially strong and especially significant, in my opinion, at least, when there's talk about the afterlife, for example. So it's like, that you're living this life only for the sake of living this supposedly other life that you're going to have at some point. And this exists outside the Abrahamic religions as well. And so when viewed to that lens, I do think that is a little bit dangerous in this sense, because I do think it kind of downplays reality as it is, as you're encountering it, like the only life that we actually know of for sure. However, I do think that's a very like oversimplified view of religion that we have gained kind of in the West, as a byproduct of modernity, as a byproduct of kind of like modern scientific materialism and so on. I would say probably the biggest, the biggest factor in demolishing that view is if you actually look deep into it, like if you actually read like primary ancient literature about people who were I'm mostly familiar with Christianity, but I'm pretty sure you'd find the same in Judaism and with Islam as well. But if you actually read those people, like and like how they live their lives, like it's anything but comfort. It's like that is the hardest life you can possibly have. Like first of all, it's a life, like if you talk about comfort, you can say to some degree that the non-religious life is the greatest comfort you can have, because nothing matters. There's no ultimate meaning. There's no ultimate rules. I'm oversimplifying a little bit. These are all very philosophically debated things, but generally speaking, this is a decent way to grasp the modern framework. But on the religious view, it's exactly the opposite. It's like every decision you make matters, and it has ultimate sacred significance, and you are a constant evolving piece of work that you will never be able to finish. That is like, well, you can, yeah, you can achieve, some traditions have this idea of like that you can achieve union with God at some point, like theosis, for example, or nirvana in kind of like a Buddhist context. But for the most part, it's like you will always be doing this. You always suck, and you're going to be horrible forever. And not just that, but the fact that you're horrible is actively making the world worse. And a large part of why the world is so bad is because everyone is falling short of this ideal. So like when you have that perspective, which is the ultimate, true, deepest religious perspective, that is anything but comfort. Like that is the complete opposite. So yeah, that's how I would address, like broadly speaking, kind of the first part of the question. The second part of kind of like, how I view religion for myself specifically. First of all, that's a huge question. Like you mentioned, I do have my book. So for people that are interested in such things, especially if they like psychedelics, I invite you to read my book. So yeah, that is pretty big. But I would say, if I can kind of like summarize it as much as possible, I would say religion is a map of reality. It's like it's something that you wear. It's kind of like some goggles that you wear that makes you look at reality in a particular way. And then you change your behavior, you change your way of being, you see other people differently based on this conceptualization of the world that you have inherited. And then you see the legitimacy of that map by how you are able to act in the world. So it's like, do you get better? Like, are you a better human being? And also, I would say, like, and that is a moral dimension, which is very important. But there's also another dimension, which is more ontological, which is like about metaphysics, but metaphysics in like the philosophy sense, not metaphysics in like a supernatural sense of like, how does the world actually exist? And this is very complicated to unpack, but I just want to briefly mention that also you can have more confidence in your existential map if by wearing it, you have deeper insights into reality. So for example, something that convinced me a lot about Christianity is even though I've been studying like human behavior for ages, like I've always been super interested in psychology. I have a degree in psychology. I have a master's in neuroscience. So like I'm pretty technical, like at least compared to the average of like knowing how human beings work and how human beings interact. And then when I was pretty old, at least for my standards, you know, at least I lived a long time until I kind of made this more religious switch. But when I did put like the religious goggles, that then it allowed me to dig deeper into reality about human relationships and kind of like what drives the human world. And so yeah, that's roughly how I'll put it.
The follow-up question would be that we have seen popular atheists like Richard Dawkins, like the four horsemen. So what do you think like they get wrong about religion?
Basically everything, except for the fact that they are right to the point where religion has lowered itself so much to meet the standards of the scientific worldview, where it was kind of like forced, and this has a very complex history, but you know, through history, it started seeing itself, it's seeing the subject matter of religion to be more and more analyzed into scientific terms. So like, did this event happen or not? And that was one of the many reasons that led to like more fundamentalist movements. And this is kind of worldwide now, but it's especially like heavy in America, in the US, which is also even a bigger problem because the US has such a heavy leverage on the world culture, so that kind of tends to spread. And so they are right to criticize like that very like shallow conception of religion. And I think they make some decent arguments. The problem is that that's only the level of religion of someone that just has been either very deeply indoctrinated through this scientific lens, and yet like, that's the only context that it applies really. But if you look deeply into it, like if you go back in time, because one of the issues about modernity as well is that people have no sense of history whatsoever. Like they just assume that things are obvious and like this is how as people thought, and like what we think is this is like the standard. But like if you look through history, things change so quickly.
Yeah.
And one of the things that will change is like how people conceptualize religion. And so, and then if you have that type of perspective, then you go back and you read kind of like the arguments of the new atheists. And first of all, they're not new. Like literally none of it is new. Like some of it is like as old as we can get. Like especially that, for example, that the world is just like a combination of like particles randomly like moving about, let's say. Like that goes back to pre-Socrates. Like that is not new by any stretch of imagination. And that's wrong in scientific terms because of physics now has to deal with fields. Like it's not a substance that is ultimate reality in the sense of like the smallest denominator of matter, which is not even matter in the first place. But so yeah, that's the only thing that they would have value is like this character of religion, which I don't think is valuable anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that science doesn't have all the answers for the questions that we have, and also that I mean, it kind of like negates the human experience. Like it always asks for the like evidence, and also like hypotheses and theories and all. But I mean, the fundamental thing that we need to, I feel like we should see is the human experience, like how it is kind of like making us like go through that evolution, like in the individual one, the individual self. Yeah, I mean, so like if we see throughout the history, like as you mentioned, there are so many cases where we have seen the religion people fight among themselves. So be it be like Protestants and Catholics, or like in currently like in the Middle East, Sunni and Shia. So in the 12th century and like thousands year back in India, in Hinduism, they used to fight among the Shivaites and Vishnuites. So if so, as all religious scriptures proclaim that they advocate for peace, and they kind of like help the humans to be better people, but still at the end of the day, like people kind of like waged wars. And I mean, I can be totally wrong about it, but my understanding is that when a belief becomes an identity, a person can go to any extent to defend it. But do you think like we should limit the belief in God or like belief in religious scriptures just for spiritual purposes and not to fight among ourselves?
Yeah, these are very heavy questions. So first of all, just before addressing that, I just want to make a comment on kind of like your reply before about like kind of like this element of human experience compared to like science doesn't have all the answers. And I
Hmm.
would say the human experience is actually where you should look. Like
Yeah.
religion should be interesting to you because you see it reflected in your own life. I
Mm.
don't like too much when people say, you know, science doesn't have all the answers, therefore religion, because it makes it feel as if religion is this like metaphysical aspect of reality that just science can't reach. And there's some elements where you can make those arguments philosophically, but
Mm.
it's not an area that I like to go as much. For a lot of people, that's just very alienating, especially if they're very scientific mindset. So I think the human experience is definitely the place to go. Now, about your question in terms of like conflict and violence and whatnot. So that is, yeah, that is super complex. But I would say probably the first place to start when thinking about conflict in relationship to religion is that like, here's one way to think about it. At the very least, if you divide the world into two perspectives, the most basic one possible that you can get, at least for these kinds of purposes, can be at the very least a religious one and a scientific one. And what does either one say about human nature? It's like the religious one is like, you know, there was a fall of some kind, like right. So it's like human beings are flawed and they're prone to being prey to passions and power and all kinds of things that are destructive, right? And then you have the science perspective, which from a evolutionary psychology perspective, at least I'm not saying this is like the totality of things, and there's
Yeah.
arguments the opposite way, but there's definitely lots of evidence as well, just purely from a scientific perspective, that we also have all kinds of aggressive drives that are either manifested and then too bad, or that they're not manifested just because there's such a like cultural norm and like cultural institutions that kind of limit that to some degree. So that is the best place to start when thinking about religion, which is like no matter the perspective that you take, human beings are just flawed and they're prone to power and to do crazy things. So that's given. Now, one question that you can ask is, does religion make that worse? Right? And that's a very legitimate question. And from a historical perspective, you can certainly be inclined to see it that way. And then there's definitely good arguments for that. But I do think that that is a bit of an oversimplification. So first of all, when you look down at the history and like the connection of history and violence, like it's very nuanced. Like because we're so anti-religious now, like we have crafted this narrative of like religion, you know, just connected with bad things in the past, bad things. A lot of them were led by religion and vice versa. But if you actually look into it, like a lot of times it's just full of nuances. Like there was a lot of political forces that had nothing to do with religion. A lot of people just bad and they're just using religion for it as an excuse,
Yeah.
but they didn't care about religion whatsoever. So there's all those kinds of things. But an important thing is to say is any kind of framework that you can use can be used for evil purposes, and that's not excluded to religion, right? Like that can literally be anything. It can be a philosophy, it can even be science, and there's plenty of historical evidence for that as well. And so that's just kind of unavoidable. And also, again, if you look through history, you'll also find many ways where religion has helped the other way, because you mentioned like kind of this notion of identity, of just like let's not attach ourselves too much and then kind of like divorce. And I totally understand that perspective, and I think there's a very good argument to that. But I do think that it's a bit more complicated because your identity is what you attach yourself to, and a lot of times how you define your identity is like where do you draw the border into certain things? And one of the things that religion does is like, this are the borders that actually matter, that actually have ultimate significance, right? And so, for example, one of the things that you can, so, obviously religion has been used for a lot of bad things, but a lot of the ways that it has also influenced these kinds of decisions is also, let's say that you are going to do a war of some kind, or that you're planning some act that has bad consequences, right? You can just say like, you know, if someone like calls you out on it and says this is immoral, but then you can say, well, so what? I'm just going to do it anyway. Or you can just say that is your standard, right? Like, I don't care. I just want to build an empire, right? So like, who can call me out to like prevent me to do this, right? How can you persuade me? Well, the best way to persuade me is if there's something that the entire community recognizes has higher authority. And that doesn't have to be metaphysical, right? Like, even atheists do this, except that the principle that they hold against themselves is their conception of justice. But then justice, like, that's not a material thing, right? So it's like, so you can call the emperor out, let's say, by saying, you can't do that because it's not just for this and this reason. And even though you're the emperor, even though you have all the political power, even though you have, all the power to do it, and the wealth, it's still possible for me to call you out based on this higher principle, right? And that is an important aspect of this issue of identity, which is like, you can say, well, let's not attach ourselves too much because then that has bad repercussions. Like, yes, but that also works in the exact opposite way, right? Which is like, I do want to attach myself to things that I think are the most important because I don't want those things to be violated. And so the notion of identity is actually super, super complex. That's something that I cover on the book near the end, and it's still something that I'm grasping a lot with. It's very complicated. But I'll say that's kind of like how I sketch it out in terms of your question.
Another question like is kind of like related to this. When I see the debates of conservatives in America, so like Ben Shapiro or like the others, so the common point they bring out is that by following the religion you will be more like moral. So it's kind of like if you become an atheist you will be more or less like immoral kind of person. So but there has been like studies that, like, I cannot recall the scientist name, like he has studied 10 years with the chimpanzees and the like apes. He kind of came up with that morality is kind of innate, like someone doesn't have to come and teach you. How do you view this point of view, and what thoughts that you have about this?
Talk about Sapolsky maybe with his work on bonobos.
No, it's not Sapolsky, but like he's mentor or something like that. So he shared his post on
Not
some.
sure if I know who it is, but yeah, about So first of all, I don't like kind of that argument too much because it feels, I think it's just a stupid perspective, to be honest, which is like, let's believe this thing just because it has a positive. Like, no one can do this in their right mind. Like that's just not how things work. I think that's just an awful way to do it. I think the only way they do it is just because that has all kinds of like then political associations that they like for their own agendas. But I think that's about a bad take. But about morality more broadly. So obviously you don't need to believe in God to be moral. Like, anyone with just straight sense like knows that's true. Like, but that's not quite the issue. It's not so much that morality, it's not so much that you need theism to be moral, but more so that theism presents you with a way of being that puts morality at its center. And that's a different thing. Like, it's still about morality, but that's a very different perspective. And when you do that, that has implications, like, and that has consequences and outcomes, certainly for the individual, but obviously society is a collection of individuals. So like that's going to have repercussions at societal level as well. But the best way to view that is, in my opinion, at the individual level. I think it's very dangerous to think about, to have this like puppeteer, like puppet master perspective of like, let's engineer society and this is the best framework to produce like that's just not how it works. And I think when people do that, it's almost always very ideological and very political. So I try to stay with it. Just as you said, I think that the best place to start is always with the human experience. It's like, do you make sense of this, and does it allow you to dig deeper into reality? And then that will manifest itself in a moral way eventually, if you're doing it correctly, at least.
In the book called Predictable Irrational, I think you are aware of it. So the author mentioned that in some cases even honest people will cheat. So he run the experiment that he's divided the people into two groups: one who doesn't have to read the 10 commandments, and one who have to read 10 commandments before writing an exam. Even though they are allowed to cheat, people who have read the 10 commandments, they are kind of like stick to themselves. So, and they did not cheat in the exam. In that point of view, I feel like religion kind of repeats the what you should do, what should not do. Like it's kind of like puts the human in a more moral path.
Yeah. The so a lot of the cultural manifestations of religion are very ritualistic in nature, and a lot of what's driving ritual is the aspect of memory. Is for you to remember. Like the ultimate religious existential way of being is that you're trying to reach somewhere, you're trying to become someone, but you can't. You keep falling, right? Like it's the cosmic fall, but repeated like every second of your existence forever. But you can kind of like pick yourself back up if you just remember the highest good, right? And so that's why the memory helps. That's why ritual helps so much. And what the experiment that you said works precisely because this way. Now, a counterpoint to that is that there's also been research in this area where they don't use religious symbols of justice, but they use secular ones, right? So they use like the late justice, for example. And you also see the same effect there. And that's not like, I don't think that's an argument against religion. What I think that is because religion is a system of this way of being that doesn't need you to conceptualize like the ultimate in this very personal way, which is, first of all, really obvious because the East, for the most part, doesn't have that in a lot of ways, at least many of the traditions. So obviously that's the case. And so that's why you see secular symbols having a similar effect. Now, the problem with secular symbols is that religion, because it's so ancient and because it's so encompassing, all these symbols talk with each other all the time, and they're all very coherent. They have a very deep history. So it's a very tight, like compact, powerful thing. And with secular, it's kind of like it helps because it has this memory function, but it's a lot weaker in general if you try to like completely secularize your life.
So we have talked about organized religion, but now I want to talk about uh, that why, like, when people are so desperate to escape from the suffering and pain, they often resort to cults as well. So what is that like in cults that they offer so much towards the people, that people gravitate towards the cults and cults leaders? Like what do you think, like, there is so much of special about them that organized religion doesn't offer?
Yeah. Yeah, good question. I'm not super well versed in the psychology of like cult behavior, but if I would guess, I think part of the issue with cults and ideology in general, and I would say cults is like ideological when it like when you can push it as far as you can to some degree, is that I think that they function a lot like religions, which makes people drawn to them, makes people kind of like feel very drawn to them. And so I think there's several ways how that manifests itself. One way is community, and that's especially prevalent now because now community is dead and everyone's super lonely. There's a lonely epidemic and so on and so forth. Another one is a sense of direction as well. It's like usually in the cult, the cult is about something. It usually has a narrative with it as well. It serves as a map of life. It's like this is what the world is like. This is where the world is going. There's also an issue that I think is very underrated now, which is also cults. I'm not sure if it's universal, but it's certainly the overwhelming of them have a specific leader. Like they're not like decentralized entities. I think that never happens, or it's very rare. So I think there's also this deep human need as well of following someone that's very charismatic, which is again what generally speaking kind of religions are formed of. And so that's just a few of them that come to mind. But the issue is that they do that without, number one, without a deep moral dimension. A lot of the times, I think that's already a fatal flaw. I think philosophy also suffers from from this problem in general, and I think that's also a bit dangerous. But then another issue as well is that it's completely like divorced from tradition in any
Mm,
way. So it's like it's just whatever goes. And one of the things about tradition is that like e- even if you're completely secular, like if you just analyze it as like an evolutionary psychologist or even a biologist, it's like you can appreciate it for like its functionality. Like you can think of it as like as its mimetic like power of like function in the as a function of yeah kind of like the effects that it can have on the individual and the effects that it can have on society and how the individual and the group kind of like coordinate together. And so things, simplifying a little bit, like tends to evolve towards something that kind of works and that it's not too stupid. But if you do something from scratch, then the chances that you'll build something stupid are a lot higher. So I would say those are the biggest things that come to mind is kind of like trying to offer a lot of the things that religion has, but without any checks and balances to like not like make it go crazy. And also there's probably a lot of individual levels as well. So it's like if someone is very deeply like lost in life and they feel very chaotic, maybe they're depressed, maybe they don't have support, maybe they're really struggling, and they see this system that offers a simple map of life, and then you see this very charismatic person. There's probably a lot of the elements of cults, I think, but it's kind of like a gradual progression as well. So it's like if you were presented everything like straight away, people would be like, "Oh wow, this is crazy." But that's usually how it happens. It's kind of like you discover it a little bit, and then as you get initiated, then you learn more about it, and it's kind of like have this slow progression. And people end up, in a completely crazy system in a completely crazy community, and they're not even sure how they got there.
yeah, one thing that you mentioned, the fundamental thing that cults get wrong, it is the moral aspect. So, I mean, I think you might be aware of Osho, like like, I mean, there is a documentary about Wild Wild West or something. So he, like in his cult, so there is no relation. Like you can have any sexual intercourse with anyone that you like. So the fundamental, like it's kind of like total freedom. So even though he have mentioned something like, okay, one should not do and should not do this, he did the exact things he said, like what he should not, what one should not do. So like the aspect of the wealth, and so he's kind of like negating the notions that one should not like pursue those things. But like I read somewhere that he has somewhere around like 30 cars or 40 cars or something like that. So it's kind of like, even though he's prophesizing something, so he's kind of exactly following the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And you see this a lot of times. I think this is super common. First of all, I think it's super common with this like more like new age spirituality gurus type
Mm,
things. But you also see it a lot in America as well, in Christianity, for example. Like
mm.
these people that preach and they'll have like private jets and like all kinds of
Yeah,
crazy things,
mega
right?
churches.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly, right. But then this goes back to the ability of calling them out, right? It's like you're calling them out by this other principle that they have to submit to, right? So that's the issue.
yeah. I mean, I want to ask a question. Like, if you are free to not to answer it, what do you think about the Church of Latter Day Saints? So, like, there is an ongoing the conversation that it is kind of like a cult group, cult community. So, there's what do you think about it? I'm just curious.
What's the name again?
Church of Latter Day Saints.
I've never heard of it. I think at least by name.
It's more, I think, in the parts of Alaska and like where in the middle of USS. It is
I'm not
interesting. Like
familiar.
I watched those like so many videos about them, so I got curious. Like what is? I mean, even though they are following the Christianity principles, but there is something about them that kind of like has the cultish group, the cultish notions about them. So yeah, I mean, I'm also interested to know about your thoughts on shamans and tribal gods. Like around the globe, there are so many tribes, and they have come up with their own gods and like rituals and goddesses. So in the West, they label these gods, these rituals, and these people like spiritual healers or like superstition and pagan. So, but they also, I feel like, offer some relief and comfort to the to the tribal members. Like like what do you think about then that like more and more people are going to Brazil now for what do you call that, haya ayahuasca retreats. So, I mean, what do you think about like the spiritual healers and how it is so different from the organized religions?
Yeah, tough question. So, in terms of like shamanism in general, I would say probably the best place to start is that they're just proto religions to some degree.
Mm,
And this is very controversial. Like, tons of people would then argue with me that I'm being kind of like too Western because it has an
mm.
implicit bias of like a progression, whatever. This is super complicated. People would kill me for it in some circles, but I think that's the best framework to see it. But also when I say that in a positive sense, at least in my opinion. It's like they're the maps that these cultures have come up with. It's like, this is what life is. This is are the stories that matter to us. This is how we relate to those stories. And these are the kinds of rituals that help us for the objectives that we have set. A lot of times objectives that are not explicit, that are in the stories. That's the whole point of the stories, right? And they have this way of life, right? And that allows them to live the best way possible, at least to their conception, which then brings the issue of comparison, which is like I think that's also one of the good ways to think about religion is kind of like they're all aiming at something, and then like if you're trying to like compare them into some degree, it's kind of like what are they aiming for, right? But yeah, the proto religions I think is a good place to start in terms of kind of like the ayahuasca kind of phenomenon. That's also something that has been very, very critiqued, especially recently, like in the last 10 years, ever since the 2000 psychedelic renaissance. People call it, what's the term? Kind of forgot, but something like psychedelic tourism or something like that. And they mean it in like in a very negative sense because people go there. I mean, yeah, it's complex. To some degree, I think it's very negative because people go there out of a sense of just having a wild experience. Sometimes
Mm,
that happens. Another thing that I think influences a lot is that people see it as exotic. Like because the world has been so anti-religion in modernity, what happens is that people are so fed up with it that if you mention any religion whatsoever, that's kind of like more mainstream. People are like, yeah, I don't like that. Right? But because religion is so fundamental to the human heart, then if you present something that's kind of religious, but that's like very different from what you used to, then people are like, this is amazing. Right? And I think that's a lot of the appeal of shamanism and kind of like earlier culture, which is like, yeah, I can get something like religion, but it's not like this, stupid stuff
um,
of Buddhism and Christianity and whatnot. Yeah. Um, but yeah, but there's also an element which is I think that needs to be recognized, which is not that negative, which is one of the problems with psychedelics in the West is that ultimately, well, this is debatable, but generally speaking, it's not something that is very mainstream in our culture. Like we're kind of like
mm,
importing it kind of out of nowhere. But a lot of traditional cultures, they do have that in their culture, like embedded, like right at the core. It's almost as central as you can possibly get. And again, because of what I was saying earlier, of like how religions are like this super interconnected system, it actually makes a lot of sense that, to take psychedelics in this context, because like you're not just being thrown into an experience that then it's very hard to interpret because the possible tradition that you're in, either a sacred religious tradition or no tradition whatsoever, if you're just like completely secular, then it's like you have this whole problem about like what does this mean, what should I do, and so on and so forth. But if you go to a shamanistic context, then the shaman will tell you this is exactly what it means, and this is how you deal with it, this is how you incorporate it into your life and whatnot. And it might not all be propositionally true. It doesn't mean that you have to accept that, that you met this very specific spirit and that this happened, this many years ago or whatever. But at least it tells you a story to like make some sense of it. And then you can kind of work on it as you please. And so we also have to recognize that aspect that they have this deep tradition that we don't have, that probably I think drives people towards those practices, and towards those experiences as well. And also another aspect of this kind of tourism, again, on this more positive sense, is that a lot of people also don't have any other choice because, like, psychedelics, have great promise to treat things like depression and PTSD. And so, even if you're not someone that's kind of like attracted just by the exoticness out of it, even if you're very respectful, and even if you're not chasing it because of that, a lot of the times it's your only option. At least if you want to have some support, because psychedelics aren't legal yet, and so if you've been battling with PTSD for 30 years and you've went to the psychiatrist and you've tried therapy, you've tried every medication
Mm.
and nothing works, like your only option is to either get it illegally, which is its own set of problems. But then on top of that, then you don't have any tradition to put that in. But then if you go to Brazil or Colombia or Mexico or
Mm.
whatever, then yeah, you have somewhere safe to do it, people who are experienced, and they give you like a cosmology to work with.
Yeah, and there is also a community around you. You can feel like truly connected, like with whoever you come with. And like I read about this psychedelic retreat in the book called The Myth of Normal. Is a Gaber Mete. He went to Brazil, so he shared his experience that one of the shaman came up to him, like said something like, "You are too shattered to heal." So then the shaman took him aside. Did the ritual separately. Like the shaman thought that okay, government is kind of like influencing everyone in the community is kind of like not to have the like affecting the effectiveness of the entire retreat. So like he talks about it very positively. But I have to say that I don't know nothing about psychedelics and what they are about. So I really interested to know like what is a psychedelic and are they like some discussion that I have been part of. They said that the psychedelics are kind of addictive. So if you like, I mean, as you
They're what?
said,
Sorry.
addictive. So like if like you continuously take it to get that experience that you felt, like as you mentioned, like without the cosmology, so you kind of like it is kind of like the empty experience. You don't feel like you might get that experience, but you don't necessarily don't have that the what do you say that the understanding of it. So I'm interested to know like what are the psychedelics and like what they do.
So psychedelics are drugs that change your brain chemistry, in a variety of ways, but generally speaking, one of the things that they seem to be involved the most, at least that's the easiest way to go about it, is that number one, they kind of decrease networks in the brain that are associated with the sense of self. So that's why in a peak experience, which is kind of like a threshold that seems to occur in the phenomenology of psychedelics, where it's kind of like, because sometimes there's certain experiences which are kind of like gradual, right? It just gets more and more intense. But there's some aspects of experience sometimes which are a bit more binary. It's kind of like a boolean of like either true or false. And the peak experience is often described like that, where you just stop having yourself completely. And so that's a pretty large mechanism of what's happening in the brain with psychedelics. Another issue as well that's pretty important as well is that there's a lot of areas of your brain that talk where they usually don't talk. So that it's kind of like a more one way to think about it is that it's kind of a more creative state, and there's more possibility. That's one way to think about it, which is also is very likely why it's so helpful for psychiatry, because one of the issues with psychiatric condition is that you seem to be stuck in a very specific pattern of being and a very specific pattern of behavior, right? So it's like in depression, you shut yourself down. You have these like very rigid beliefs about yourself, very rigid beliefs about the world. It's kind of the opposite of what I just described, right? So like instead of having this openness and this, kind of like places talking with each other, it's like, no, it's kind of like this tunnel vision that just gets
Like
smaller and
yeah.
smaller over time. So yeah, I think at least from kind of neuroscience perspective, I think that's the most basic and helpful framework. But at least the work that I've been doing is that I think this perspective is very true and very helpful, but I think it also misses an important point, which is, at least to me, one of the things that has always been super fascinating about psychedelics, which is also why I got so interested on it, like since I was very young. Like I started researching about it when I was, I don't know, maybe 18 or something like that. I'm 30 now. Number one, like the fact that the fact that they seem more real than real. Like to me, that has always boggled my mind. Like, how can that possibly, like, how is this a thing? There's a lot of types of experiences where you are deceived about reality, right? You might have an hallucination, you might have a dream, you might have something like that, right? But something very peculiar is that once you have these altered states of consciousness, when you go back to your normal state of consciousness, then you recognize, oh, that's not real. That's not coherent with other things that I believe about the world and how the world works. But psychedelics are not like that. You enter this different state of being that you think is real and more real, but then also when you come back, you still say that's real. And like that's such a bizarre thing. So I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects. And then I think that's also connected with what I think is missing a lot of the times from this very neuroscience perspective of this century, which is, and I think it's a bit problematic actually of kind of like how psychedelics are being conceptualized in the world now, which is that which people are referring to as more real than real. Like that is not a random thing. Number one, like it's not like everyone is pointing to different things. No, everyone is pointing to something that's obviously not always the same thing, but it definitely has a lot of overlap, number one. And that also seems to be associated with wisdom traditions. So, like all of them, what they're pointing is like some sense of the sacred. It's also pointing to the primacy of meaning over reality as a place of objects. And then also that thing that they're pointing to, not only is it like very coherence to some degree with wisdom traditions, but also that's what's allowing them to have the personal transformations that have made psychedelics so powerful in our culture now, and why now they're just exploding in terms of popularity and kind of like all the politics around it finally being lifted off and all kinds of scientific research. And so all these things to me are just kind of impossible to ignore. And at least for me, that's kind of like
Mhm.
what made them so interesting.
Yeah, I mean the feelings and the experience that you had, like uh, while taking this academic. So I am interested to know, like, what is your, like, how was your writing process be like? So you have these experiences; they are very hard to translate to the words and make sense to the readers. Like, what was your like writing process be like?
Yeah. So my writing process was more or less, especially in the beginning, was more so write as honestly and as free flowing as I possibly could. So like I would literally like how I set up my sessions most of the time is that I would watch a movie in the beginning of the experience, which just kind of like made me in the right mood. And also it allowed a nice transition as the substance was kicking off because it takes quite a while. And then often thoughts would come into my mind. I would write them down, like literally just in a Google Doc.
Mm,
I would write until I didn't feel like writing anymore. Then often I would go to my bed, I would put headphones, I'd listen to some music. Some other thought would pop up that I think was worth noting. I would come back to the computer and just do that until the experience is over. Then at that point, I would just have a huge document with a bunch of random thoughts. Sometimes that's a bit, depending on the experience, depending on what I was talking about. Sometimes that's very hard to understand. Other times it's a bit more understandable. And then once I was sober, then I would kind of edit that out, like try to make it a bit more intelligible, like correct mistakes, things like that. Has the book progressed? I was a bit less strict with like how real time the writing was because I felt like it was just kind of counterproductive. So in the beginning, because in the beginning I conceptualized a lot of the book has like kind of like a trip log, like if you're in the psychedelic community, trip logs are very common. Of just like I'm just sharing my experience. Like I took it. This is what I experienced. It might be interesting for people that are
oh,
interested in this kind of thing. So that was kind of my mindset at the time. But then the more I wrote, and also because I gained a bit more confidence in myself as well, because eventually I did my undergrad and eventually I did my master's as well. It's more like, you know, uh, the writing has worth not just because it's an experience, but because I think I'm seeing some part of reality that I think is true to the highest possible sense. And I'm trying to articulate it as much as I can so that people see what I see in the world. And so if that's the case, there's more importance to making your writing clearer. And so I took more liberty about like writing, like polishing up more as I was sober and things like that. But yeah, that was my writing process, loosely speaking.
while taking the psychedelic unleash the creativity in a person? Do they feel more creative after taking, or like while having that experience?
To some degree, yes, because part of what they do is that they loosen associations, and so part of creativity is that you are framed in a certain way, like you're framing a concept or reality or whatever it is
Mm,
in a box, right? And so part of creativity is like to know that you're in a box and to escape it,
mm,
right? That's a big part. So psychedelics definitely help with that, and also that's super obvious because that was a huge part of psychedelic culture in the '60s. Like every single artist probably in that decade and even the decades after, like all the way to the '80s, and probably even more. Like there wasn't a hard cutoff, but like all of them were like super enthusiastic about psychedelics. They discussed it openly. Like was huge at the time, and it's for that reason. However, it is a bit dangerous, I think, to be overly optimistic about psychedelics making you more creative because even though they lose associations, I think it's like a tiny boost to your existing creative. Like if you're not a super creative person, like you're not gonna take psychedelics and then like you're gonna write the best novel ever. Like that's just not gonna happen, right? So like so yeah, it's not gonna make you a genius. It's not gonna make you do anything meaningful like right away. It's just like loosens you a tiny little bit so that you can think a bit outside the box, which then helps with creativity. But the issue with creativity is that, I mean, this is complicated because even defining creativity is a bit tricky. But one way to think about it that has been a bit popular is that you have to break the box, but then where what you do with that has to be useful for a given purpose, because otherwise it's just kind of randomness. Like it's not anything. And you also see this a lot with psychedelics as well, because a lot of times it's like, you know, you read some psychedelic logs and whatnot, and people have these crazy ideas, or like they do these crazy paintings. It's like, you know, I got so much outside of myself, like it's so new. But then you think, is this an equality? And sometimes the answer is just no. So yeah, that's how it works.
you are a deep thinker, like you are interested in philosophy, psychology, and intellectual concepts, but do you ever felt, or like do you feel the intellectual loneliness, that like even though you have so much going inside but you don't have anyone to talk with? So do you feel that?
To some degree, I do, but also, I mean, I'm not a super social person, so like this doesn't affect me personally a lot. But also, it's almost impossible to be in a niche, like no matter your interests, where there isn't a community for it. So like, even though I'm very deep in philosophy, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of other people that not only are deep in philosophy, but a lot of them are way deeper than me. Some of them might look at me because like I read a lot of philosophy, but like I also read tons of other things, and like I have other hobbies and stuff. And like there's some people that are like philosophy is their entire life. So sometimes it does get a bit lonely, obviously, because for in terms of like the average social context, like you're very diverse, like you're very distant, let's say, from the average person. But at the same time, if you're willing to seek out a community with your interests, you know, whether that be philosophy or neuroscience or whatever, there's always going to be people that are just as passionate about it as you were, and very likely even more.
Oftentimes we want to share our thoughts with our friends, or like the ones who are closest to us. When we are trying to tell them, when they don't get it, that frustration, do you feel that? Like I feel that every time. Like
Yeah,
I get
exactly.
so many thoughts about so many things, but when I share them with people, either they get it on surface level or they don't get it at all. So I feel that the intellectual loneliness, I mean, that is a part of the reason why I started this podcast, so that I can have such conversations with people. Yeah.
Yeah. That that's brilliant, because that's exactly the same thing I did. Like I also have a podcast, and I started it just for selfish reasons, which is like I want to have cool conversations with cool people that are interested in the same thing as I am. So it's like if other people want to listen in, that's fine, but I'm happy if it has 0 listeners because I had the conversation. And also, like what you were talking about, kind of like not having this, not being able to have these discussions with like your close friends or close family, like for all the evils of the internet, that's also the beauty of the internet, right? Which is like at the distance of a click, you can just find people that like the same things as you do. Which without the internet, if you have niche interests, like that is so difficult. Like, you know, especially if you don't live in a big city. Like if you live in something like New York or London, then that's a bit easier. But like the average city, you know, if you're deep into philosophy, like finding people like that, can go to university and whatnot, but like it's quite difficult. But in the era of the internet, it's quite easy, and that was what made me start the book page, which is like because I was sharing, because initially when I started reading, I was sharing a lot of this stuff on Facebook, which is kind of like what I used the most back then. It was the most popular social media at the time. But I just had my normal friends. I had people from fitness, which is kind of like my career at the time. I had my family and whatnot. And like a lot of people just didn't care. So it was like I was posting philosophy, but like no one cares about philosophy, right? So I was like, okay, if I make this page just for this, then I'll find other people that like what I like. So
I mean, we have one commonality between us. So I started my Bookstagram page because of that. So I don't have anyone to share my thoughts with or like share what I am reading. So at least in on online, I can find the my community, my tribe, so that I started that page. So now it is somewhere around 170 something like that, 170K. I mean, it's good to have people talking about books and sharing their opinions and their reviews. I mean, like no one person thinks about the book in the same way. So everyone has their own perspective. So that like they kind of like introduce you to think in a different way. I mean, that's a really good thing about the internet. Yeah. So I want to ask one question regarding the one of the philosopher called Hegel. You know, right? I think
well, I certainly know Hegel, the philosopher, but I'm certainly no expert in Hegel.
like there are so many memes I have seen about him. It's kind of like there was one meme I have seen. It like he is saying that I start a sentence, I don't know where it is going, but somewhere it will go. So like he's kind of like summarizing the entire philosophy. It is saying that okay, I don't know like what I'm writing, but I'm writing. So like Hegel
Yeah,
is kind of like
although
most hated philosopher, kind of like right now. Yeah.
yeah, Hegel is right up there. Just his writing is very difficult to some degree, which is where kind of these memes come from. It's probably the hardest reads you can possibly do. Like even Hegel scholars debate endlessly about certain sections of like what exactly he means and whatnot. Although it's kind of funny that those memes sometimes get it a bit wrong as well, because like it's not because like he knew exactly where he was going. Like his philosophy is very systematic. Like it's very like it has a system that's very internally coherent for the most part, and definitely has a purpose. It's just very tough for other people to understand it. I'm not 100% if this is legit or it's just kind of become a meme, but at least it's a common saying that kind of Hegel towards the end of his life said that no one really understood his philosophy at all besides himself. It's like he wrote all this entire body of work and like nobody gets it.
What do you think of Jordan Peterson? Like he started off like really good, and after COVID, like he kind of like becomes too much of himself that right now like no one is kind of like paying attention towards him. So like it's kind of like everyone used to take his thoughts and his words too seriously like before COVID. So I don't know like what happened to him after COVID. What do you think about him?
Yeah, he's a very weird kind of phenomenon. I'm not exactly sure what to make out of it, but like I think he had a good impact on culture at some points where he was just a good popularizer of really good ideas. Like he made Jung very popular, like, almost on his own, which is kind of crazy. Like, he gave a lot of thought towards Nietzsche, towards Kierkegaard, and lots of other thinkers. Some of his like interpretations are a bit debatable. He gets some stuff wrong. Some other stuff he also gets completely wrong. Like a lot of his takes on postmodernism are very bad, and he just lacks a lot of knowledge in philosophy in general. But I think he had a really good impact on that front of just like thinking more deeply about these issues, taking religion more seriously, about the maps that I'm speaking. I mean, he uses this metaphor a lot.
Yeah, the maps
Architecture of
of meaning.
belief,
There is a one book. Yeah, something.
like maps of meaning, the architecture of belief, like it's right in the title. But one of the things about him is that he was very political and he was very ideological, and it seems that he got more and more political the more fame he got, and yeah, and everything just went downhill from there. And then he also had some health issues. Maybe that affected him in some way. I'm not exactly sure. But yeah, now I kind of hate talking about it because I really don't like how he presents himself. I also don't like some of his political ideas, also don't like some of his philosophical ideas. But I do think some of his work is quite valuable, especially Maps of Meaning. Like if you take all the politics out, like some of the stuff, not only is it very good, but also it was surprisingly brilliant by how old it was. Like if I go to some of the chapters, I'm like, this is brilliant, like just brilliant synthesis of like philosophy and cognitive science and neuroscience that like to the date where he wrote that, like maybe 20 people in the world were like talking about those ideas. Well, now it's a lot more like a lot more common. So I hate talking about it because I do hold that in high regard for him. But also I don't like to say that because then people, if I say that, people think that I like him. And then people start to attack me for all the things that he gets wrong and for all the stupid things he says. And so I'm always forced of this
Mm,
binary about him that I don't like to, yeah, I don't like to play that game. So I try to stay away from that as far as possible.
I get it. I mean, I feel like sometimes he intentionally tries to make simple things more complex. I feel like, especially you can see that in his writing, like adds so much of technical jargon that like no one understand. Like I tried to read his book like when I was 19 years or 20 years old. I think the 12 rules for life, I think. So I couldn't pass the 30 pages mark. I think like it was like kind of like not, I would not say difficult, but like why are you like trying so hard to make it difficult? So I felt like that. So
Yeah. He definitely has. Yeah, he's definitely not gifted for making things simple. I don't think, at least a lot of the times, I don't think it's always intentional. Like some writers like do it just for ego, just so that they look smart. And there probably is a good degree of that, but also to some degree, I think that's just how he expresses himself. And also, at least I don't know about Rules for Life. Like I never read it because he was already going super downhill and I already hated him back then. At least in Maps of Meaning, some of the stuff is just complicated. And like also, there's this thing about technical language, which is it's hard. A lot of times it's hard to grasp, but then once you grasp it, then you can move a lot easier because like it puts you in the right mindset of like how to think about certain concepts. There's this funny phrase in philosophy which I love, which is it can be abused, but I think it's very useful, which is philosophy uses big words in order to avoid big sentences, and it's like that's exactly right.
so the final question would be like, what are your like top five book recommendations? So that you feel like everyone should read these books,
Tough question. I would
be it be
say,
philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, anything.
yeah, okay. Well, I would say for general neuroscience, general psychology, I would say Behave. It's just a wonderful book. It's just very, very good. I would say Philosophy Has a Way of Life by Hadot, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It does require some philosophical background, but it's not super hard to read. But it's about kind of going against this idea of like philosophy has this like overly intellectual thing, but when instead it's a very um, it's a discipline that's very embodied about making your life better that has been kind of neglected as history went on. What else? I'm super bad at recalling things from the top of my head, so this is a super tough
Yes, three
um,
more.
question for me. Three more. Okay, let me think. Be- because I have such a hard time of remembering things from the top of my head, I'll go in a slightly different direction, which is I think something that's very underrated with books is that obviously you should read things that you like, but also to some degree, a lot of times you just have to read things to learn, like to be a more educated person. And something that I find very lacking about about book Instagram, for example, is that people always read these like random books because they look kind of cool and whatnot. And I mean that's fine. I don't want to be like too I don't know too antagonistic towards it, but like to some degree, if you want to understand the world better, sometimes you just have to learn the basic disciplines. So it's like instead of sometimes just looking for this new sexy book, it's like if you want to be a deep thinker and like think things that aren't stupid, like you have to be basically educated about psychology. So like get a psychology textbook. Like it doesn't have to be the one that's 1,000 pages long. You don't have to be an expert on developmental psychology and social psychology and all kinds of subfields, but at least get a basic one. Maybe find the shortest one you can, and now you have the bare minimum knowledge of psychology. And the same thing for history, the same thing for philosophy. And so yeah, because I suck at recalling things from my head, that's one thing that I would do, which is like be a bit more open minded towards just learning fields as a whole, rather than just picking stuff that you like, because that's how you get an overall good education. And also, this is pretty important because then when you read those books that are sexy, then you have a better like education in order to absorb that. It's like, oh, actually, this contradicts a lot of evidence that I read this, and I know that evidence is really solid, right? Because what I see on Instagram a lot is that people are reading all these books, but like they have no foundation to like know if any of it is any good at all. They're just passively consuming, and it's like, yeah, whatever. I read this, it's probably true. Like, I don't know.
What do you think of Robert Sapolsky? So I read his book Determined. I did not read the behavior. Like I read halfway something. I did not finish. But when I read Determined, I mean it was good because I don't have anything to compare with. So it's just the only book I read about free will. So it felt good, like reading a document, so much of like information about like free will, okay, the determinism, randomness, and everything. Because I don't have any prior knowledge about the subject, I felt like this is good. But what do you think of him and his books?
I think he's great. Yeah, I respect him a lot. I think he's a super like very well respected like scientist and intellectual. He's probably one of the most successful scientists like of this day. All his books are very good. Funny enough, I don't like I think my politics are a bit different than his, which sometimes shows a bit on his writings. And I'm certainly, and the same thing on philosophy as well. For example, I certainly don't think his take on free will is particularly good. I think it's a bit oversimplistic. But overall, I think it's great. I recommend Behave to anyone. It's a very long book. Like it's not hard to read. It's just a lot of pages basically. But I highly recommend for anyone that wants to understand human beings, basically. So yeah, highly recommend it. I think it's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Tiago. Like, thank you for joining with us. It's really lovely talking with you. Like, I hope like we will have another episode or some other time maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, of
So
course.
thank you.
Thanks
So,
for having me.
yeah, I
It
mean,
was great. I really enjoyed it.
everyone check out his book In Search of Infinite. So after listening to the conversation, you will have an idea of like how is he and what thoughts he has and what kind of books is interested in and what kind of thoughts he has. So like I would be excited to read. Probably I will get it next month or something like that.
Okay, amazing. Thanks for having me. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.